So thank you for joining us today, Fabrice. It's really good to have you with us.
Thank you, Amy. Delighted to be here.
Well, I'm looking forward to speaking with you. So today we're going to do things a little bit differently. So sometimes the Human CEO is an interview with a leader about their career and their leadership style. Today we're going to do things a little bit differently because I want to speak about your book, The Art of Retreat. So can you, first of all, tell us a little bit about that and tell us where that came from, please?
Well, the book, The Art of Retreat, came out of my experience practicing retreats, both for myself and with groups of clients. I've always, I don't know if I have, I've been a monk in a previous life, I don't know. But I've always been attracted to spending time out of the busyness of life. And specifically in places that inspire, right? Be it in nature, in beautiful locations. And I think when we get into a place like that, whether in a group setting or alone, we get into a different level of energy. Our brains calm down, and so I've always been a very strong advocate of taking time off the busyness of life, both for professional purposes, but also as a tool for personal growth. And so I've been leading retreats for a long time, all sorts of retreats, meditation retreats, yoga retreats, executive retreats for executive teams, going on retreats myself. And I thought at some point, why don't I remember it was during COVID. So, that it was a little bit of a weird time for all of us. I imagine,
agreed.
Right? And so I thought, why don't I start putting together my experience of these retreats and create a guide in a way for anyone who is interested in exploring their inner life a little bit more in depth, a sort of step by step. This is how you do it. And not, in a way that is inaccessible, like you need to take 3 weeks and go to a monastery in Thailand, but in something that you can do at home, something that you can do if you have 1 hour and you're willing to go for a walk in the park next to your house or in the forest or on the beach. So something very accessible for everyone, but that will take the reader in a progressive deepening of their inner life. And I've written the book particularly with people in position of leadership in mind, because quite frankly, that's what I know. I'm not, capable, I think, of writing a book for teenagers or young adults, even though I have one at home. But I deal with leaders all day long in my profession, and so I thought I would dedicate the book to people in positions of leadership. So that's the genesis of the book.
That's interesting. And can you, before we get into the book, because I've got, like I said in the pre-record, I've got pages and pages of notes because I think it's really valuable. There's loads of insight in there. But before we get into that, can you just tell us a bit about your background and the evolution of your career and why you work with leaders now, please?
Yes. So I grew up in Paris, as you can probably tell from my accent, but I left France when I was just after graduation. So really, I've never really worked in France. I left to live in Spain, London, and then I settled permanently in Asia more than 25 years ago. So I've essentially spent most of my adult life and most of my professional life in Asia, living in Singapore and traveling around the region. I'm an engineer by training, studied business school, and so I went, like many MBA grads, I went into consulting, ended up working with a well-known consulting firm called McKinsey. I was a partner at McKinsey, so always in Asia, right? And left to change career completely. So from strategy, very analytical work, I changed career completely and went into leadership development. First as an executive search consultant, and progressively, because I was working and recruiting senior executives, CEOs, board members, I started also supporting them in their career transitions, giving them career guidance, and I got interested in the topic of how do we develop leaders, how do we accelerate careers, and that brought me to working as a coach, both for senior executives and also for their teams. And that's essentially where I am today. So a couple of years ago, my alma mater, McKinsey, asked me if I would rejoin. It's a firm that I've always loved and have tremendous respect for. And I thought going back to McKinsey, not as a strategy consultant, but as a CEO coach, was absolutely too good an opportunity to pass. And so today I look after the leadership development practice of McKinsey in Asia. So that's me in a nutshell. Married to a Singaporean lady and one daughter who still lives with us, 24 years old, and she studies psychology.
Amazing. So is she following father's footsteps, do you
Well,
think?
we're having more and more professional conversations at the dinner table. Let's put it this way.
That must be an interesting transition as a father.
Well, it's always interesting, isn't it, to see
Yeah, it's
kids
never
grow up.
boring.
I tell you, I am much more comfortable supporting CEOs in their personal growth than supporting teenagers.
Fair enough. And as a mother, I would concur. I can imagine.
I know my limitations.
Yeah. Fantastic. And so the book then. So let's talk about The Art of Retreat, because I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it. There's lots of insights in there, and I think it was quite early on in the book that you made the distinction of the skills of leaders. Often and I'm paraphrasing now, so forgive me, but often they've got the skills horizontally. They can work horizontally very well, but they don't often look at the vertical and go into sort of reflective mode. I'm sure you can give a much more succinct, articulate explanation of that, but that was the key. That was the bit that I thought, yes, this is fantastic. This is exactly what I'm looking for.
Yeah, and we find this intersection of the horizontal and the vertical in a lot of spiritual traditions. So I didn't make it up. I wish I had, but I
It
didn't.
was a
But
good hook, though.
it is right. The horizontal dimension is essentially time, the passing of time, and so time is what gives us a sense of destinations, right? I want to achieve something, whether it's a personal objective, a company, corporate objective, etc. And in order to get there, I need to do a number of things. So this is the world of doing. And of course, the more productive I want to be, the more stuff I'm going to try to cram in the same time span. And that's why when we have this epidemic of busyness, of trying to do more and more and more in the limited time we have. So that's the horizontal dimension. The vertical dimension is not the dimension of doing, it's the dimension of being. And so that's the dimension of deepening, of letting time stop in a way and deepening the present moment. So you find this concept, in Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now, for example. Right now is the only moment that exists. The past is the past. It's just in our memories, and the future is imagination. It hasn't happened yet. So the only reality that we have is the present moment. And so stopping in the present moment to go deeper into what is happening right now, in this moment, right here, right now, that is the vertical dimension. And we normally don't pay too much attention. I know that when I was a busy executive, I didn't pay too much attention to the present moment. I was always I either thinking about the past and what I should have done differently, or anticipating and being anxious about the future, but rarely appreciating what I had in my hands at the present moment. So that's essentially the horizontal dimension and the vertical dimension.
And I guess that's where the concept of, not the concept of retreat, but the concept of the art of retreat, instead of the push and the go and the drive and the drive and the drive, it's actually taking that time and creating that space. So in the book, you spoke about the 4 S's.
Yeah, so the 4 S's are the preconditions to a retreat. And again, I want to I want to make it very clear that I'm not asking anyone to shave their heads and wear robes and enlist in some, cult or sect. A retreat is really something that is accessible to anyone in a very easy way. And so the 4 S's is to say, look, if you can find a place where you can be alone. Now, it doesn't mean that you're in the middle of the desert and there's not a soul within 100 kilometers. It simply means that you go on your own. You don't go with friends and other people. So you're on your own. The second S is for silence. So you're going to stop talking. You're going to stop reading your emails, your messages, etc. You disconnect the devices, and then you get into a world where you're much less solicited. There's much less disruption, interruptions. So suddenly time opens up because you're not constantly fragmented. Right. The third S is about finding a space that resonates with you. And we all have them. We all have favorite places where we sort of resonate with the vibes of the place, right? It could be a place in nature. For some people, it could be the beach. Others, it's the mountains. Others, it's the forest. It could be a room in your house. It could be a place in a church, in a temple, anywhere. Any place where you feel that there's a certain energy that is conducive for you going into this vertical dimension of the being rather than the doing. And the last dimension is the last S is for the spirit, your willingness to reconnect with your spirit, to let go of the outside world in a way and focus on what's inside. So if you can combine these 4 S's to say, I'm going to go alone in silence, in a place, in a space that resonates with me, and I want to reconnect with my inner world, then this is a retreat. And it doesn't have to be 2 weeks in silence. It could be 2 hours. It could be a Sunday morning before everybody else wakes up in the house.
Those are the golden hours sometimes, aren't
Yeah, exactly. The golden hour before, just before dawn, right? That's a beautiful time for a retreat.
they? Absolutely. And so you spoke about solitude and loneliness, and I really love the distinction that you make between, because it can be lonely in a leadership position if you've not got the right peer network around you. It can be, there are people in the organisation maybe you can't lean on or talk to internally. And so you make this distinction between loneliness and solitude. Can you share a bit more about that, please? Because I think that's an important distinction to make.
Yes, loneliness is not having relationships, and it's a terrible thing. We I think know people who are lonely. It's getting worse, I think, in our modern societies because we're more and more isolated. But going alone on a retreat is not loneliness, it's solitude. Because you still have your relationships, but you're just putting them on the pause button in order to create the space that you need for your own inner work. So, solitude is something that will open up possibilities, whereas loneliness in general closes possibilities, in particular the possibilities of what could unfold from the relationships. When you go on retreat, you still have the possibility of all the relationships that you have, and you can examine these relationships on the retreat. But when the retreat ends, you go back to those relationships, hopefully as a changed person, because you have developed a better discernment about how you want to support and nurture these relationships. So solitude is actually a tool that you could use to deepen relationships with others. So it's all the opposite of loneliness.
It's powerful as well. It's powerful to be able to, excuse me, it's powerful to be able to be comfortable in your own presence and your own solitude. It's powerful to be comfortable in that, because I think often people, and this maybe links into the spirit element, so feel free to jump in. But in terms of being alone, some people are fearful to be alone and stop and just connect with the inner voices. I think sometimes that's terrifying for some people. Is that fair to say?
Yes, it is fair. Um, I I can totally empathize with that, because that's been my case for many, many years. I was not very good at being alone until, I'm not too sure what changed actually. Maybe it's the midlife crisis at 40, or what it is. But uh, there's so much peace that comes from being alone in solitude, when we know that we don't have to be alone, but we do it by choice.
Well, it's a choice. Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
And when I realized that, because after all, we have, you know, tons of relationships. You have all your friends. You don't see them every day, but they still exist, even though you don't speak to them and you don't see them. They're still in your life. So you don't have to be physically with people to be connected with people.
Yes. Yeah. Now more so than ever.
Exactly, exactly. And so going on a retreat, on a short solitary retreat, doesn't have to be scary, because all the relationships are still with you. Not any less than if you were, back at home in the busyness of life, because you're not seeing all your friends at the same time anyway.
Yeah, I think there's a confidence as well in being comfortable on your own. So I took myself off backpacking at 23 on my own around the world, and I remember being in Auckland and being alone and thinking, oh, I can't go to the cinema on my own. Why would I go to the cinema on my own? And I thought, I'm just going to do it. I don't care if people are, think I'm bizarre or lonely or I've got no friends. I'm just going to own it. And I remember that was the point when I was like, I'm okay. I'm fine by myself. So I went to the cinema. I ate on my own sometimes. Obviously, made loads of friends on the way around. But I just remember this confidence boost of not everybody's comfortable doing this. And somehow I've figured out how to be alone. And from that point on, I wasn't scared of it. And now at 43, I see the power in solitude and the clarity that you get when you're alone and you sort of alone with your own thoughts. They're not always the best thoughts because we're only human, but sometimes you have to choose solitude in order to get that clarity and that creativity. And I think that's why the book resonated so powerfully with me.
Yeah. And do you agree? Do you agree with me that solitude is a fantastic tool for personal development?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. You can almost, when it's just you can almost get out of your own way. Does that make sense? And it sounds almost like a dichotomy, but when you are just you talking to you, and I hope this doesn't make me sound too out there, and if it does, it does. But when it's just you talking to you, I think you can get a clarity of mind that you can almost call yourself out.
I find that it's very difficult to hear the whisper of the soul when we're constantly in a noisy environment. And by noisy, I don't necessarily mean loud noises, like the traffic outside, right? But it's
Distracted.
the distractions, the millions of messages I receive every day on WhatsApp, emails, meetings, and I love being connected to the world. Don't get me wrong, but it's that constant background noise that makes it very difficult to hear really the whisper of the soul. And it's only when you go on these retreats, that's why I'm such an advocate of these retreats, is that suddenly the level of noise, physical, figuratively and properly, the level of noise decreases, and then suddenly we start hearing things that we don't hear normally. We start seeing things that we don't normally see. We start paying attention because there's less distractions. So that's been my experience. Even like today, right? Recording this from a hotel room in Jakarta. Very often when I travel, I look at my hotel room almost as a place of retreat. And I go back in the evening, and I say, well, I have a couple of hours before I go to bed, and that's going to be a retreat. I don't need to turn on my computer and watch a series on Netflix. I could just spend a little bit of time on my own, not messaging, not reading emails, maybe just sitting and looking out of the window, or maybe reading a book, or reading some poetry, or writing in my journal. That's something that brings, your level of energy down and opens up your receptivity to your inner life.
It's almost as if wasting time needs reframing as, I don't know, expanding time or using it differently. When you just said sat in a hotel room looking out of the window, I can't imagine. I can because I've been there, but in a previous life, I couldn't imagine someone with your background, with your skills, with your calendar, and what your schedule must look like in your role, just sat staring out of a window. But actually, it's really powerful to be able to do that and use your time in that way. But it's almost as if that needs reframing, that you're not wasting time by looking out the window. You're giving yourself the time to reflect and the space to think.
It's taken me a while to get there, because as you say, I led a fairly busy life for many, many years. Today, as counseling CEOs and senior executives, I have to be able to bring them into a place of calm and quiet. I have to be able to, whatever time we spend together, 60 minutes, 90 minutes, I have to be able to create that peace, that place of peace, so that we can have a deepening of the conversation and an exploration. Let, whatever needs to unfold. So I have to be able to embody that. And I think any coach, I mean, you're a coach, I'm sure you can relate to that. Any coach who listens to us will relate to that. We have to embody what we preach for our clients. And so in a way,
take your own medicine.
Exactly. And so I'm very disciplined in following my own personal practices, because just like, if I were, I guess, an athlete, say a runner, right? I would be practicing running. And because largely my profession, like anyone who's in the coaching world, or the counseling world, or the therapy world, largely what we do is holding space for our clients. My personal training is not running in the stadium. It's meditating, being in silence, looking out of the window, reading, journaling, practicing breathing, because then I can create that space for my clients. So it's not a luxury. Looking out of the window is actually professional work almost.
Necessary.
I mean, I say that, it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine that someone could get paid for looking out of the window, but in a way, it is what it is, right?
But it's almost necessary then, isn't it? And it's that sense of, if you were sort of running from meeting to meeting to meeting, trying to hold that space for your CEOs, and you were just back to back, and you were frenetic and chaotic, and you'd not spent some time reflecting and being in a place of, is serenity the right word? But if you weren't in a space where you could then come in and hold space for them and give them the platform for them to do their best thinking, it wouldn't work, would it?
I love the word that you've used, serenity. I also use equanimity sometimes. That it's, in a way, this is what we bring to our clients. And in truth, when I work with CEOs, they have a much harder life than mine, because they're constantly under pressure. They have huge expectations from their shareholders, from their boards. They're leading thousands and thousands of colleagues in an environment that is increasingly more volatile and more complex and harder to make sense of. So it is really, for me, first of all, an honor when a CEO wants to work with me, but I see it as my duty of care to be able to hold the space and to bring them in a space where they can have a a 1 hour to go on the vertical dimension, rather than be planning, what is the next meeting, what are they going to say to their to the next AGM, or in the next team meetings. I create a magic may not be the right word, but sort of a privileged space where we can really explore what's going on in the present moment, and then always tie it back to, okay, what does that mean for the next day, the next week, the next month, the next year? How are you going to use the insights that you get from this conversation to make 2024 the most successful year of your career, for yourself, for your colleagues, and for your company?
And is there a process? Is there almost a slowing down process, Fabrice? So when you encounter that resistance, they must, especially in the first meeting, if not almost every meeting, people must come to that meeting sort of in that space. It's horizontal, it's time, it's go, it's drive, it's pressure. Is there almost a process of slowing down that you need to go through with these CEOs when they meet that resistance of, I haven't got time for this, or I can't do that reflection because I'm distracted, for want of a better phrase?
Yes, and the techniques I use, and I describe some of these techniques in the book as well, is simple mindfulness, for example, spending a few minutes just with the breath, with the eyes closed. Closing the eyes, really, really shifts your brain waves very quickly from beta to alpha. So you immediately get into a space that is much less action oriented and much more contemplative, just out of closing your eyes and focusing on your breath. So I do that with my clients, and every one of my colleagues in the group that I belong to at McKinsey. We do that very, very regularly. We do that in team settings as well. So, for example, when we coach a team, people arrive and they're all happy to see each other, and you can sense the energy very, very high in the room. But there's an agitation, and very often, because we run retreats offsite, so we go to a nice place, and so the participants, which is usually the executive committee of a large corporation, so very, very senior execs, the level of energy is very high, but we're not going to be able to explore the topics that we want to explore with them if we don't lower that level of excitement a little bit. So we practice very simple meditation techniques. I very, very often start with a breathing meditation or breathing exercises. People who work with me make fun of me, but I bring a Tibetan bell, a Tibetan bowl to my retreats, because I find the power of sound is quite powerful as well. So yes, it's I'm sure you have your own techniques, right, to bring people in the present moment as well.
Into the space.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's important though, and I think in terms of you can't get to that place unless there's a process to get to that place. You can't just stop and start. You can't just come from the busy leadership role where you are under pressure and go, right, okay, it's time for meditation. You can't just step into it, can you? There has to be a process.
I found that rituals are very powerful to take you from one space to another. So, for example, if you're going to do your own short retreat at home, lighting a candle, there's nothing magical about a candle, right? I mean, it's a wick with a piece of wax around it, right? But just the act of lighting a candle is a gateway into the space of retreat. And so similarly, when I work with executive teams, for example, I ask them, what is the ritual that allows you to go from one meeting to the next? Do you run from one meeting to the next? Do you finish a Zoom and click end and then immediately click on the next link and start? Or do you take 1 minute and take 3 deep breaths, for example? Close your eyes, take 3 deep breaths to recenter yourself, because that's a ritual. It's a gateway into the next meeting. so that it allows you to refresh and reset, your level of energy, so that you can come to the next meeting without carrying all the weight and the agitation of the previous one. So I find
It's so
the
necessary.
yeah, exactly. I find the rituals very, whether it's on retreats or in daily life at work, very important.
It's important what you just said about the three breaths between Zoom meetings, because especially in COVID, I was speaking with a lot of HR leaders and CEOs through COVID, and they were just back to back to back to back to back. So they did just that. They clicked end and clicked start, and there was no walking down the corridor to change meeting rooms. There was no nipping to get a coffee. It was just back to back to back. But even if we all have those days, don't we, where it needs to be back to back, although they should be less frequent probably than most are. But if you can just disconnect, take those three breaths, and then go again, that can be really powerful.
Yeah, yeah. One technique that I've learned from some of my McKinsey colleagues is, instead of starting meetings on the hour, to start the meetings 5 minutes after the hour. So, you start the meeting at 10:05 instead of starting a meeting at 10. Because if you say, I want to finish the meeting at 9:55, it's never going to happen. Let's face it. Right? But if you start the meeting at 10:05, actually, maybe some people are distracted, they don't look at the time, and they log in at 10. But that gives you the few minutes to recenter yourself, do a ritual, and then dial into the next call, or with having had that little moment to reconnect with yourself and go in that vertical dimension before running again on the horizontal treadmill.
And also, it's not forgetting that your teams will be in a very similar position, although the level of pressure may, on the surface, seem less, but it might feel the same to them. They might feel that they're under the same level of pressure. So, from the concept of contemplative leadership, you're also sort of recognizing that your team need that bit of time and space. And so that brings me on to my next question that I wanted to ask. So you talk about contemplative leadership within the book. Is there an element of sort of cascading that down to your teams to ensure that your teams are giving themselves the headspace or the solitude, or is this just a leadership tool, or can it be cascaded down to the wider team, to the management teams and beyond?
Yes, it can be cascaded down, and to a certain extent, it is the part of the responsibility of a leader to create a space for the team that is conducive to build more trust, build more psychological safety, um, handle conflict skillfully, align on what we want to achieve, commit together to what we want to achieve. And all these actions take time. And I don't think it's appropriate to try to rush through these steps. When I work with newly formed teams, or it could be an existing team that has a new CEO, for example, uh, I always encourage our clients to take time to work on the team, not only to work on the business. And having the teams work on the team, on the dynamic of the team, on creating a space where we can actually be more aligned, be more productive together. That takes a lot of energy, and that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of emotional energy, because we need to explore vulnerability so that we can know each other better, and we can work better together, and we can trust each other more. So it takes emotional energy. I find that leaders who have gone through their own contemplative leadership journey, whether with me or some leaders are very naturally inclined towards all the tools that come from the contemplative traditions. I find that they do that very well with the teams, because they're naturally open to this vertical dimension. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, leaders who are extremely driven to do, achieve, push. Not that there's anything wrong with achieving results. That's the purpose of any corporation. But being solely focused on achieving and being solely focused on objectives, milestones, targets, which are all destinations, instead of focusing on the journey and creating a meaningful journey on how we're going to get there. I find that these leaders tend to wear out their teams. It's they tend to extract a lot of energy from their teams. And a contemplative leader is someone who instills energy in the team, who nurtures the team. So then, back to your question, it is the responsibility of the leader to share their tools, their skills, their practices with their teams, because each member of the team is, in his or her own right, a leader. Typically, if you work with the CEO of a 10,000 people organization, there might be 10 people on the exco, but each of them has 1,000 people under their responsibility. And so you can see how this cascades down. We start at the top because you're never going to achieve anything if you don't start at the top. But the practices have to cascade down over time so that we can progressively create a space in the corporation that is safer, where there's more trust, there's more joy, there's a greater sense of why we're doing this, because we're not just doing it because we want to increase shareholder value. Again, nothing wrong with shareholder value, but it cannot be the end in itself. There has to be a sense of meaning in what we do. So it cascades all the way down. And it doesn't have to be complicated, right? There's simple techniques that we use in our work with our clients that are very, very easily replicable. So one example is the technique of check-in. So you start a meeting, and instead of diving straight into the agenda, you say, why don't we take a few minutes and everyone around the table will share, how are you feeling this morning? Is there anything that is happening right now for you that prevents you from being fully present? And what would you like to achieve out of this meeting? And it goes fairly quickly. But if someone has a distraction because a kid is sick at home, or they have an important meeting 10 minutes later or an hour later, we know that we're not going to get their full attention. So the process of check-in is a very good way to, it's a ritual, right? So it's a gateway into the meeting, but it's a very good way to center everyone, and also to identify why someone might not be at their best. And occasionally, as a result of the check-in, we can tell a person, look, why don't you skip the meeting? Go take care of what you have to take care of, because you cannot be productive in the meeting today. This simple check-in is extremely easy to replicate all throughout an organization. And some organizations that we have worked with, we now come back years later and we see people doing check-ins as a regular process before they start a meeting. So it's small things like that. I'm a big believer in micro practices. Yes, you can have grand schemes and grand principles, but I think when we work with our clients, we have to give them very practical tools, which is what I've endeavored to do in the book, right?
Yeah, there's all sorts in there. I think in terms of the reflections and the journaling prompts as well, that's really powerful. But what I was thinking from the teams as well, if thinking about the contemplative leadership, if you're giving yourself space to be a better leader, everybody within your business is a problem solver in some way or other, whether they're trying to solve how to code something effectively, or they're in customer care and they want to solve customer problems. And I think if you were to able to filter down those micro practices, as you called them, and allow your people the space to be able to reflect and find that creative space, they would solve problems maybe more creatively or more effectively or more efficiently. And so I really like the idea of filtering down those micro practices so that it's not just the domain of the leaders to be able to have space held for them. I wonder, have you seen that in practice?
Yeah, absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. And very often, as I was saying, we start working at the top because that's where we can really have the biggest impact. And ultimately, that's how we're measured by our clients: is have we had a positive impact on their organization? So we start at the top very often, because part of the process that we follow with our clients is to take them on retreats. So we ask them to choose a nice hotel in nature, and I have the privilege of living in Southeast Asia, so there's, as you know, there's no shortage of wonderful locations. So we ask them to choose a nice place, and we take the executive team there, and for a couple of days we make full use of the connection with nature. We ask to have meeting rooms with views. I don't want to be stuck in a basement in a room that doesn't have view. I cannot function on retreat mode if you don't have a connection with the outside world. And so then very often the participants in our retreats come to us and they say, hey, I want to do this with my team, because this has been so powerful in creating a transformation of our executive team. I need to bring this to my own team. And so it's the beginning of this cascading process when that happens.
I love it. I love it. I'm in. And so in terms of another concept that I just wanted to run through was, he talks about reductionism. So on the vein of the horizontal, we're always on the go. There's always so much to do. There's always, there's initiatives and achievements and meetings, targets. But then you talk about, was it Dancing with Complexity was the chapter that this is in. Can you share a little bit with us about the power of the reductionism?
As a leader, part of our role is to simplify things. We take complicated problems and we bring clarity. That's
We should.
So we should. And so this pattern recognition, ability to create order out of chaos, if you want, is a key characteristic of a leader. Now, to do that, we have a number of tools. A lot of these tools of management have been at our disposal for 100 years, 150 years. They came out of the Industrial Revolution, when we suddenly had a lot of power at our disposal, the physical power, right? Because we were extracting coal and oil from the ground, and so we could power machinery, and so we could scale businesses to levels that had been totally unimaginable in the 17th century. Suddenly, at the end of the 18th century and all throughout the 19th century, we've been able to scale production capacity to a level that was unthinkable before. And so to manage these large scale processes, we've created tools, management tools, organization charts, command and control, standard operating procedures, budgets, controls, plans, performance appraisal. I mean, all that stuff is 150 years old and hasn't really evolved. Okay, so nothing wrong with that. That thanks to these tools, we have trains that depart and arrive on time. We have planes that fly. We have hospitals that function well. We have roads. We have bridges. We have cell phones, telecommunications, the internet, etc. So thanks to these tools, we have been able to create what I call the engineering world that works remarkably well and has basically lifted the world out of poverty. And today, by and large, in most countries around the world, people have been extracted out of, abject poverty, except in some pockets of the world. But, it's amazing what we have today, thanks to this engineering world. Now, the world has become a lot more complex than it used to be. could argue it's always been complex to a certain extent, but frankly, what was the use of doing budgets for 2020 when suddenly COVID happens, right? And your budgets are worthless. And so we live in this world where it's becoming harder and harder to connect cause and effect. It's the butterfly effect, right? The butterfly could flap its wings in China, and you have a hurricane in Mexico, right? So in an engineering world, I connect very easily causes and effect. Right? If I apply more power to my machine, I will have more output at the end of the assembly line. But in today's world, it becomes very, very difficult, to connect causes and effect. And so this reductionist approach, or this set of tools that we have that are supposed to give us simple recipes to organize large-scale production, that doesn't work anymore. So, and you see that in pretty much every corner of society. For example, predicting inflation is next to impossible. You have the absolutely best, the absolute best PhDs in economics working for all the central banks, and they always get it wrong. Predicting financial markets, obviously, if anyone could do that, they would be very rich. So predicting traffic patterns, predicting how cities are going to grow, predicting how a corporate culture is going to evolve is next to impossible. I know that I could incentivize people for certain behaviors, but I don't know exactly what is the resulting culture that this is going to create. And this is usually the law of unintended consequences. We're well-meaning, we do things, but a small reduction in benefits, for example, could trigger a strike that would have massive proportions. So all these examples to tell you that it's becoming harder and harder to connect causes with effects. There's no more causality. And it's impossible. Epistemologically, it's impossible to connect cause and effect. We will never be able to right? It's not a question of computing power or AI. It's just that it is impossible because there's too many agents connecting with too many agents. So in this world, the reductionist approach that has served leaders very well doesn't work in the face of complexity. So you need an entirely different set of tools, basically. The engineering world, the technical world, and all its tools work very well for technical processes. So if you're going to operate a train, a plane, a hospital, that works well. But if you're trying to launch a new version of the iPhone, that doesn't work. There's no way that you can predict what is going to be the market demand for a product that doesn't exist. There's no way we can predict what AI is going to look like in 10 years. There's absolutely no way. So you need a new set of tools, which starts with the ability to say, I don't know. Now, this is very difficult to do for a leader. Because as a leader, I'm not paid to say I don't know. I'm paid to say I know, even when I don't, right? And so there's almost a schizophrenic attitude now where for a lot of leaders, they still need to say I know and I can predict what the future looks like because that's my job as a leader. But in fact, I have no clue.
Do you think that's changed slightly since the pandemic? Because I feel in my experience and my observations, I guess you could say, since the pandemic, I think the most credible leaders were the ones that said, I have absolutely no idea how we're going to get through this, but we are going to get through this. And here's what we're going to do to figure it out. Do you feel as though that's sort of shifted slightly since the pandemic?
You're absolutely right. In a way, that is one of the good unintended effects of the pandemic, is that it has showed us how incapable of predicting the future we are. And that's not for any deficiency of ours. It's just because that's the way it is. So we cannot predict the evolution of complex phenomenon. They're going to self-organize, right? Because every system ultimately organizes itself. Right? If you build a company, it will develop a corporate culture, except that you don't necessarily know what this corporate culture is going to be like. And the same with the pandemic. The pandemic ran through its course, but at the beginning, if you go back to March 2020, there was absolutely no way of knowing at what speed it would develop, at what time we would develop herd immunity. Of course, different countries followed different strategies in a genuine attempt to do the best they could. But there was, and with hindsight, we could say, look, some countries have really not done well, and some countries have done extremely well. But it's only with hindsight. We can connect, I think it's Steve Jobs who said, we can connect the dots with hindsight, but we cannot connect them with foresight. And that's a key characteristic of the complex world. So I think the pandemic, and then, the geopolitical shocks that we've gone through, particularly with Ukraine, I think that has showed us that maybe we should approach predicting the future and in general designing grand plans with a little bit more humility. And instead of presenting plans with the certainty that they're going to work, we can present plans with an attitude of, look, this is the best I can do today. But this plan has to be a living document. We will revise it next month and next month and next month as new information comes in. And by the way, because we don't know whether we should follow strategy A or B or C or D, and we have no clue and we have no way of knowing, maybe we're going to try, these are the experiments we're going to run. And they're small experiments, so they're not going to bankrupt the company. And we will learn as much from the experiments that fail than from the experiments that succeed. Because every failure in a complex world, every failure is a blessing, because you learn so much from failures. But again, we need to change our mindset. And I think you're right, Amy. We're getting there slowly. I see leaders who are much more comfortable with saying, I don't know. And because I don't know, these are the 5 things we're going to try, and we'll see which ones work and which ones don't work. And that's partly a result of the pandemic, partly, I guess, when you get older, you get wiser, and so some leaders have become wiser with experience.
I feel as though there's a paradigm shift happening within leadership, and it's less those people that have all the answers and yes, we know what's going to happen, and it's more. So in Think and Grow Rich, they use the example of, was it Henry Ford that was in a courtroom and they were trying to test his intelligence, his general intelligence. And he used the example of, I have people around me that have all of the general knowledge and all of the specialized knowledge that I need. So I know how to go and get the answers. And that's becoming, I think, in my opinion, that's becoming what a leader is now. So we don't have all the answers, because how could we possibly have the answers with everything that's going on in the world? But I'm the person that's taking responsibility to figure that out, and I'm going to lead us through this, and I'm going to find the answers. Do you feel as though there's that paradigm shift happening as well? Do you see that?
I do. Not as much as I would like to see it, but there is a shift. I agree. And it's a welcome shift. It shows that maybe we have less certainties today as a result of the last few years that have showed us that what the unexpected is always around the corner, right?
Yes, yeah, always it seems. But there's hope for the future, though. And on that positive note,
I'm an absolute optimist. I think we're the all the tools that I introduce in the book, and all this approach about deepening the self-reflection, self-awareness, etc. I see more and more leaders who are interested in those themes. I've received plenty of very positive feedback about the book. I don't think this book would have resonated with anyone 15 years ago or 20 years ago. I mean, they would have said, well, Fabrice, are you out of your mind, right? Writing a book about the power of retreats for corporate leaders. I mean, look, greed is good, right? As Gordon Gekko used to say, right? And so I think there's a change of time. So I'm like you, I'm an optimist.
Yes, I'm happy it's changing. And so one of the final chapters is all about embracing death and the legacy piece of leadership. So can you talk us through that finally, please?
Yes. Death is a tool. I don't know if we should call it a tool, but it's something that is very present in Asian spiritual traditions. We live with the ancestors in Taoism. We meditate in graveyards in Buddhism and in Hinduism. So the realization that we are going to die, no matter how pleasant or unpleasant that thought might be, is a fundamental to anchoring yourself in reality. If you think you're immortal, then, well, first of all, you're going to be disappointed at some point. But worse than that, you're not going to look at your action as a leader in a realistic way, because I think death is a, back to the theme that we were talking about earlier on complexity. Death and bad news is a fact of life, and we can kid ourselves and pretend that everything is going to be good always, but at the end of the day, as the Buddhists say, we're going to get old, we're going to get sick, and we're going to die. So anchoring yourself in that knowledge makes you appreciate life much better, much more. Because being alive is like a privilege, it's a blessing. Why would I waste a day doing stupid things, and we can all have the stupid things we do, when my days are counted? Why, and so as a leader, it's the same thing. Why do you want to not focus on what is essential, which is to create communities, to create a sense of fulfillment, of joy, of growth for your company? Why would you want to make yourself and the people who work for you miserable, when ultimately the days that we have are counted, and we should make the most of it, and we should be grateful for everything we have in the meantime? Being at work should be an opportunity for joy. It shouldn't be, yes, we have targets. Sometimes it's hard work, etc. Sometimes there's going to be bad news. A competitor is going to do something, or we're not going to get the resources we want. But in the big scheme of things, is that really that important? Or can we still appreciate what we have and move on?
It's along the lines of the Stoics' memento mori, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's very, very connected to the Stoic philosophy.
And do you find, so I'm reading into inputs, outputs, lead and lag at the moment, but do you find that there is a massive shift when you talk about targets there, and people can be, people struggle with targets and they put themselves under pressure, or they're under pressure because they have to hit targets? And I'm speaking as a early career recruiter during a recession who had crazy targets. So I know I've walked that path. But do you find that there's a shift in perception if people are given targets that they have absolute control over versus the targets that they have no control over? So if you have a revenue target and then something like the pandemic happens and you have no control over that, that's going to be stressful. But if you have a target that you have absolute control over, whether that's the number of people that you start a conversation with or the number of people that you, connect with, do you see that there's a shift in in the perception of those targets and how they're received.
Absolutely. And that's why I always say, let's hold the targets very, very lightly, because ultimately targets are nothing meaningful, right? I could have, for example, I could have a sales target, 1 billion. Okay. But that's a completely arbitrary number.
And that's the stress. That's where the stress comes from.
Should I start, blaming myself, be, putting a lot of fear and pressure on my teams because we're going to land at 990 million instead of 1 billion? Yes, we have missed the target, and I'm not encouraging anyone to miss targets, but there's so many factors that are out of your control, particularly in a complex world, that ultimately you control the inputs. You do not control the outputs. And
But
all
for
too
so many
often,
organizations,
well, yes, you're right. All too often, we're measured on outputs as if we could control everything. But I can control the inputs. I can control the amount of energy I put in my work. I can control how I lead my teams, how I inspire my teams. There's a lot of things I can control. But ultimately, what happens with the interest rates, what happens with the foreign exchange, what happens with the geopolitics between US and China, not, not much I can do about it. That might cause me to miss my targets. But if so, should I still feel that I've done my absolute best, and therefore should I still feel fulfilled if I've missed my target? And I would say probably you should still be happy about what you've done
I would say change the target.
and change the target. Or look, targets are good because they give a common objective for a team. But let's hold the target lightly. Let's not make it such that we're going to uh, live in anxiety and fear and despair if we don't achieve the targets. There was a book, like 30 years ago called "Don't Sweat the Small Stuff," and I don't know if you remember that, but you know, I find that the corporate world sometimes generates a lot of fear, anxiety, uh, a sense of being inadequate, and I don't see why it is like that. I really truly believe that corporations should be a place for people to flourish and develop themselves and do great things in an atmosphere of joy. And some corporations are like that, but I don't think that being always in a state of fear and anxiety and stress is really conducive to human flourishing.
No, absolutely not. But I think I wouldn't, just going back to that, don't sweat the small stuff. I think sometimes for leaders, it feels like that is the only lever they can pull in terms of the target. You've got to drive the targets. You've got to drive the targets instead of maybe taking that step back and thinking, well, are the targets what we're looking for? Because I agree with you. I mean, human exists to try and build organizations on a much smaller scale than the organizations that you work with, but it exists to build those organizations or help develop those organizations where people can thrive. And I think sometimes when people do get lost in sweating the small stuff, it's because they feel as though that's the only lever they can pull for success. Driving the targets. And that takes us right back to the beginning of the conversation with that horizontal versus vertical. Can you take that step back and create the space to go, actually, this isn't working. Why isn't it working? And what do we need to change? It's really powerful. I really enjoyed the book, Fabrice. I think that's come across during the conversation, but I really enjoyed it. There's loads of insights in there, and I recommend it to any of the leaders that are listening. But before we end, is there a question that I should have asked you that I haven't asked you, or a concept that you want to talk about that we haven't covered yet?
The question that I get very often is, how do you overcome the objection to taking time off to do a retreat? Because when I tell the clients I work with, I don't tell them anything. I suggest, how about you take half a day and go to your cabin on the beach and alone? And the answer I get very often is, well, I'm too busy, right? That's And so how do you overcome the busyness? How do you give yourself permission to take 2 hours of your busy schedule? And there's no magic recipe to do that, other than starting to question the busyness itself. Why are we so busy? For the sake of what? Because if you really had to, because there's a family emergency, for example, you would take the time. So why don't you take the time? Because this is important as well. This is your own mental clarity, your own balance, your own sense of purpose, your own self-discovery. That's at stake. That's going to make you a better leader. So why wouldn't you take the time? And in the book, I talk a little bit about how to give yourself permission, and of course strategies to continue being responsible, because it is true that we have responsibilities at work and at home, and so we cannot disappear without planning a little bit. So you can be responsible, but you can also give yourself the permission to take time for your own retreats, as a tool to not only for your own development, but just to come back out of the retreat as a better person, where everybody is going to benefit from you having been on a retreat.
Sometimes it's about questioning why you need the noise as well, isn't it, when you're busy? Like, what is it that you're avoiding by being busy? Sometimes is a reflection that's really powerful for some people.
You're so right. You're so right. It's almost like a drug sometimes, that busyness makes us feel important, makes us feel good. If I'm busy, I'm important, right? People need me.
Well, it's all over social media, isn't it? Less so now, but like the hustle culture. I got up at 4 and I worked till da 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 da. But I know that's changing, and it's not everybody.
It's also very cultural, right? In some societies, being busy is a sign that you're not that important. Because if you were really important, you would have time.
Yeah, it's the reframing again, isn't it?
In Western cultures, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world, the more important you are, the busier you have to be. And people who are not busy are deemed to be not important. But it's not like that everywhere in the world. And there's cultures, Mediterranean cultures, some Asian cultures. It's changing, unfortunately, in Asia as well. But some Mediterranean cultures where, when you're really the boss, I can tell you, you're not that busy.
Do you find that you have to overcome that objection more than once? Do you find that if they're reticent to taking the step back and taking the time, and then they do it the first time, and then you never have to overcome that objection again because they just instantly see the power? Or do you constantly have to nudge and encourage to take the time?
I find it's difficult to nudge. There has to be a readiness to do it. And what I find is that consciously or unconsciously, some of the leaders I work with, they're ready to. They know.
Yeah.
They know.
Yeah.
Yes, they're immersed in that soup of busyness, which makes the concept of retreat unrealistic. And then I give them the book, and we talk about it, and then they say, you know what? Actually, my family is gonna be on holidays. I have a few days to myself. Whatever. I'm actually gonna do it. They find a time, and then I had that with one of the Singapore CEOs I'm coaching. He said that was fantastic. That was fantastic. But there needs to be a readiness. Some leaders are not yet ready, and I find maybe it's my own limitations as of persuasion, but I find that with some of the executives I work with, it's one bridge too far. Yeah. Maybe it's a question of stages of life. Younger leaders see less the need to do that. More experienced leaders tend to appreciate retreats more. So perhaps it's a question of a stage of life as well.
Potentially. I'm so bought into the solitude. I don't know whether this says something about my husband and daughter, but I am really bought into the concept of the retreat. So often, but not often enough, I'll book like a Wednesday to Sunday break somewhere and have the Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, just me and the dog, walking the dog, doing some thinking, maybe doing some planning. And then on the Friday after school, my husband and daughter will come and join me. And that's perfect. It just gives you that headspace. So I'm completely bought in, but really enjoyed the book, even though I was already aligned with the concept. I think it's great. So thank you for
Thank you.
writing it, and thank you for joining me, and thank you for being so patient that we've run over by 20 minutes because it was such a great conversation.
No, I loved it. I loved it. Thank you so much for all your encouragements and your questions. I've really enjoyed it.
So I've not asked you the question yet about the leader that you admire. So when we have people on the podcast, I always ask them, is there a leader, past or present, famous or otherwise, that you particularly admire? And if so, what was it about them, or what is it about them?
There's a few leaders. They're not well known, but people who've been my bosses, my mentors, because I've had a chance to experience their leadership firsthand. Because sometimes you read about leaders, and yes, it sounds all very good, and maybe it is, and maybe it is not. I don't know. But people that I've worked with, one leader that I've always greatly admired is a former managing partner of McKinsey, called Dominic Barton. I think a lot of people who know him would agree with me that he's been a truly outstanding leader, just for the quality of his warmth, support of colleagues, uh, making me feel that I was the most important. I was a young partner at the time. He was already, a senior guy in the firm, even before becoming the global managing partner. And when I was with him, I felt that I was the most important guy in the room. He had time always for everyone, and that I found absolutely no airs, no hierarchy, just a truly genuine intent to help colleagues. And I was really always admirative of Dom's leadership style.
You can't imitate that. It has to be genuine
You
in terms
cannot
of those
fake it.
activities.
Yeah, I don't think you can
Yeah,
fake it. So that's one leader that I've admired and continue to admire. Him is still involved with some of the work we do as an advisor to the firm. He's done very, very well, but great leader.
fantastic. And was there another person that you wanted to mention?
There's many. I couldn't do justice to all the great leaders I've worked with. I have a lot of. I'm not going to name them to not embarrass them, but some of the CEOs I coach. I have one in mind that I'm not going to name her, but just a truly outstanding person in terms of clarity and how she aligns different interests in a complex environment, in a complex market. So yes, there's so many, but I learn a lot from the clients I work with.
I feel as much as the coaching side of things is rewarding, I feel as though that is one of the most rewarding things, to be able to share those insights and learn from those people. Because as much as you're the coach and you're drawing out insights and you're supporting them, you learn a massive amount about yourself, and also about them as individuals, but also how people think and what they need and how they operate. I think that's massively rewarding from my perspective.
I agree. Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. And a final question then, Fabrice, before I let you go, because I'm conscious that we've run massively over time, but for good reason. Is there a book beyond The Art of Retreat that you particularly enjoyed, or you think that leaders would take a lot of value from, that you could recommend? And it could be a podcast, it could be a documentary, but have you consumed something recently that has helped you, or you think would help the audience?
There's a few, so I'm gonna give you just a few favorites. I've always been a great fan of Jordan Peterson for his ability to connect the dots between psychology, philosophy, history, spirituality. I've learned a lot from his lectures. So that's one. Recently, I've started listening to Michael Gervais, who's a psychologist and specializing in high performance athletes, and he has a very interesting podcast. And lastly, I've started rereading a book that I had read a few years ago, and my God, that's a good book. It's called Transcend by Scott Barry Kaufman, and it's a fresh take on the work of Abraham Maslow, and particularly the hierarchy of needs, but put in a much very modern light. And I would really encourage anyone with an interest in developing themselves and others, leaders, coaches, therapists, to read the book. It's really good. I read it the first time, and it's really on the second reading that I see how deep the book is and how practical it is.
That's definitely going on the list. Thank you for sharing that one. That one sounds fascinating. Brilliant. Well, thank you for all of your time and your insights. I've really enjoyed the conversation. So thank you for joining us. And if anyone's interested in buying The Art of Retreat, where can they find it?
Any online retailer, and some physical bookstores. That I continue encouraging physical bookstores, even though I buy occasionally books online. But for sure, the book is on any online bookstore.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Well, I really appreciate your time. Thank you, Fabrice, for joining us.
Thank you, Amy. That was great.
Thanks for listening to the Human CEO podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, please help us share more leadership content by liking and subscribing. If today's episode got you thinking about unleashing the full potential of your organisation's culture, we've got a great next step for you. Take our free assessment at humanculture.scoreapp.com to see where your organisation stands and discover actionable insights to elevate your workplace culture.